So hello everyone, my name's Maitridevi. I'm chair of Therigatha and I live here with the rest of my community, and like you, we're in lockdown, and at the moment I'm sitting in the Therigatha Retreat Centre shrine room and looking out at our half-built earth sky garden, and beyond that a hill covered in dandelions, lovely grassy hill covered in yellow. So I want to welcome you to this year's great gathering, the Songs of the Sisters. And well, obviously we really hoped you'd all be able to come here in person, but it's not to be. So we're going to do what we can to offer you some inspiring material, to have a sense of connection between all of us, even though we're all separated from each other, and to create a sense of inspiration and delight in the Sangha and practicing together. So I hope that flavour comes across over the course of this weekend. So a very warm welcome to all of you. So I'm giving an introductory talk now on the Therigatha. So in some ways just giving you quite a few facts, just to place you, or to give you a sense of where the Therigatha is placed in the Buddhist tradition. And then over the next few days we'll be hearing lots of short talks from different members of the team with stories about a particular nun, a particular female disciple that they are inspired by or they appreciate. Yeah. So just beginning with the title, the Therigatha. So Theris mean senior ordained women. In this case, you get Theras, the senior ordained men, and Theris, senior ordained women. And so they're considered senior. It's not to do with the length of time they've been practicing, but their spiritual attainment. So these Theris are all considered to be enlightened women. And Gatha means a verse or a stanza or a song. So we're in the realm of poetry and song. And the gathas are their songs or inspired utterances. And there was a famous 5th century commentator, a Sri Lankan called Dharmacharinis, and he recognised these songs, these gathas. He said they're udanas. So it's another word, Pali word, but udana is one or more verses concerning knowledge about something, but accompanied by euphoria or joy. So it's this sense of joy that arises up, that bubbles up from the depths out of a seeing through or a wisdom. And the udanas are these inspired utterances of the Buddha. And the Therigathas are these inspired utterances of these senior female practitioners. Yeah, these remarkable sisters in the Sangha. So I'll just start just placing them a little bit. Where are they found? So they've all been collected and preserved in the Pali Canon. There's a huge number of texts in the Pali Canon, and basically anything in the Pali Canon, it means it's being treated as something really important in terms of spiritual teaching. So these are spiritual songs or spiritual poetry. Now I've got a few props for the Pali Canon. So first of all, there's baskets in the Pali Canon. So traditionally, 3 baskets or Pitaka. So you might hear of the tree Pitaka. I didn't have baskets, I've got mushroom crates. So here we go. So the first Pitaka or basket is the Abhidhamma Pitaka. And the Abhidhamma's concerned with Well, you could say Buddhist psychology, so mind and mental events. So what you might be familiar with in terms of that is Sangharakshita's Know Your Mind, or more recently Subhuti's Mind in Harmony. So they both relate to the Abhidharma, explorations of the Abhidharma. So I'll put that crate to one side. And then the next one is the Vinaya Pitaka. So this is all to do with conduct and the rules and regulations around the Sangha. And in a way all developed in terms of trying to keep the Sangha acting well and not causing harm. So obviously the precepts are involved here. So for us we have the 10 precepts. I was thinking, what's our modern day Vinaya? Well, it's mainly that, but also we've got things like ethical codes of conduct that centres have, and we've got safeguarding policies. So all of those things to make sure that we don't do harm, and they sort of evolve depending on conditions and circumstances that come up. So that's that one. And then the third basket, the Sutta Pitaka, is full of suttas. So sutta means discourse. I've got some of them, they're quite heavy. We've got the Digha Nikaya, which is long discourses. Majjhima Nikaya, middle-length discourses. It's very systematic. We've got the Anguttara Nikaya, numerical discourses, so numbered in numerical order. And we've got the Samyutta Nikaya, or connected discourses, so ones with a sort of common thread running through. And then there's a fifth book called the Khuddaka Nikaya, which is full of all sorts of shorter pieces. And it's in there that we find the Therigatha. We also find the Therigatha, which is the songs of the monks, the Udanas, these inspired utterances of the Buddha that I've already mentioned, Jataka stories, so these previous life stories about the Buddha. We have the Dhammapada, the Sutta Nipata, the Itivuttaka, and another book called the Apadana, which I'll come on to in a little bit. So that locates in the Pali Canon, the Therigatha for you. And the Therigatha is not the only place where we hear about these Theris. Yeah? So the Apadana that I mentioned is full of the life stories, the biographies of these Theris, and it also includes their previous lives, so it's like their Jataka stories, their previous lives. And in addition to that, there's also commentaries. So all of the suttas would have been commented on. It was all part of an oral tradition. And oral traditions, the suttas are recited and then someone explains them, and that's a commentary. So the whole time that these suttas are being studied and taught, they're being commented on. And then in the 5th century of the Common Era, this monk who I mentioned, Dharmapala, he did a very comprehensive commentary. He took everything that had been said thus far and systematised it and added to it and made a very thorough set of commentaries. So also his commentaries are very often used and included in the Therigatha. So he'll turn up again. And the nuns also, because they were disciples of the Buddha, either living in his lifetime or after, they appear elsewhere in other suttas in the Pali Canon. So and just to say a little bit more about the commentaries, they're because they happen later, and maybe quite a bit later, they invariably add their own flavour of those times and the attitudes of the commentator. They flavour the text that they're commenting on. So Alice Collett has written a book called The Lives of the Early Buddhist Nuns. It's sort of fairly academic, and she suggests that sometimes you get these slightly less favourable views of women creeping in. They tend to be in the commentaries. They're not there in the actual songs. So after the 5th century, after Dhammapada, there's very little added. There's what's called a gloss, a Burmese gloss or commentary in the 18th or 19th century, and then that's it. But the commentaries and the stories in the Abhidharma are fairly extensive. So you get the sense of these original poems, and then they get adorned and embellished and expanded upon. So I'm also going to try and place them a little bit in history. I have another prop for that. So this is my timeline. I think you can possibly see it all. So this is 2,500 years, which is the time between the birth of the Buddha and where we are now. So over at this end, colour-coded, yellow for Buddha. This is a Buddha's life over here. So from about 480 before the Common Era to 480 years before the Common Era to 400. So generally he's agreed to have lived for 80 years. And then during his lifetime and for several hundred years afterwards, we have the songs of the Theris. So they weren't just disciples contemporary to the Buddha. The songs came also from those afterwards. So quite a long period of these songs coming into being. And this is the year naught of the Common Era. And they weren't written down until the 1st century. So this is the Pali Canon coming into existence. So you can see there's quite a long period of time where this was all oral tradition. Then they're written down. But even when they're written down, it doesn't mean that the oral tradition stops. Yeah. So the oral tradition just carries on. What's interesting about when they get written down is when they're written into Pali. Pali is what was called, it's a spiritual language, so it's a religious language. It was also what's called a translocal language, so it was understood by a lot of people over a large geographical range. So they might have had their own vernacular language, but they all understood Pali. And that meant that the text could start to disseminate and be known more broadly. So it's quite a significant thing that they were written down. And maybe it's also important to remember that they were written down in Pali. So this is, 2,000 years ago. And Pali was still forming as a language. So actually the way they're written down then got modified and changed as the language itself evolved. And all of through this time, the commentarial tradition was at work, so explaining. And then over here, this is about the 5th century, we have Dhammapada, the Sri Lankan Theravada monk, who did this extraordinary work on the commentaries, the commentarial tradition. And also in this time, these stories of past lives in the Abhidharma were evolving. So this is how people were learning. They were taking little snippets from these songs and imagining what the lives of these women must have been like and imagining past lives. So there was one suggestion with this image of past lives that these nuns were really quite formidable. They were full-on renunciates, and that might have been a little bit discouraging for some people. So this sense of what their lives were like before, what their life was like before, and what their lives were like before gives a sense of progression where you could start to imagine how they might have got to the point that they got to when they went forth or when they gained enlightenment. And that was possibly that was just encouraging for other people who didn't feel they're quite there yet. A sense of, well, I'm working towards something. I can't manage to go forth in the way this extraordinary woman did, but I can work towards it. So what you have is, and then also this whole oral tradition, the commentarial continuing afterwards. So what you have in the Pali Canon is, Alice Collett again suggests it's kind of layers of material, so all from different times, all interwoven. So it's a bit like an archaeological dig, but maybe even more complicated than that. And the original verses, they're so far back in time, so far back in the oral tradition, we can't quite touch them. They're just slightly ungraspable the whole time. So we go past Dhammapada, and then all the way along here, And here we actually have the first translations into European languages. So a long time has gone past before it gets translated, well, first into German and then into English. So Carolyn Rhys Davies did the first translation into English. Her husband Thomas was a civil servant in Sri Lanka, and he managed to acquire a full set of a Tripitaka. Yeah, these 3 baskets, and they're all written on palm leaf manuscript. So he brought all of those back to England, and initially a German professor, Professor Pichel, translated the Therigatha into German, and then Thomas's wife Caroline translated the Therigatha into English, and she used both the German translation, she went with that, and also the original palm leaf manuscripts. And her version is very, well, I find it very passionate and poetic. It's also quite dated in a way. She was, it's definitely written in a different century. So that was 1909 when she wrote that. And then the other translations happened a bit later. Well, there was quite a gap actually. The next translation was by K.R. Norman in 1971. So what you'll find is sometimes you might have seen copies of this book, The Poems of the Early Buddhist Nuns, and it's got these first 2 translations in. It's got Rhys Davies' one, which takes up most of the book, and then it's got K.R. Norman's one, which takes up not very much, because his is very sparse. It's apparently almost a literal word-for-word translation, but it's almost sort of Zen-like. It's quite brief. Whereas Carolyn Rhys Davies, really, she was much more flowery. Yeah, I don't know whether flowery is the right word, but much more ebullient, perhaps something like that. And then the next translation didn't happen until 1991, and that was Susan Murcott, who then did a translation. And then since then we've had that you can find various translations online. Thanisaro Bhikkhu has done some, Anagarika Mahindra has done some, Bhikkhu Sajatu. I think you can find all of Sujato, you can find all of those online. And the other one that's been published in this lovely coloured book is by Charles Hallisey, and that came out in 2015. So and that's actually got the Pali and the English in it. So that's all of the facts, trying to locate where the Therigatha is. And then I want to say something a little bit more about what's in it? What is it exactly? So I suppose the first question to ask is, well, who were these Theris? Who were these Theris? So we're talking about the very earliest female wanderers, sometimes called Samami. And they were women who came from all walks of life, wealthy and poor. Some were mothers. Some were mothers whose children had died tragically, like Kisagotami. Some were young women who refused to marry, they just wanted to go forth. Others were wives who had enough of being a wife. There's a fantastic one. The Teri's name isn't actually known, she's just known as being Sumangala's mother. And she rails against her domestic life to the point where it's actually quite funny. There were courtesans like Ambapali, high-class courtesans, lower-class prostitutes like Vimala. There were sisters like Kala, Upakala and Sisupakala. There were old women like Dhamma who had to wait or waited for her husband to die before she left home and ordained. And they would live alone in the forest or in small communities. I think there was quite a lot of small communities, often on the outskirts of villages. They had very few possessions, just like monks. They had their robes, bowl, a few other things, and they would beg every day on their alms round for whatever food they could have, and that's what they'd live on. And they might live in small shacks or mud huts. It's a very simple, very austere life. So there were many communities, and there were some very quite well-known charismatic teachers, women who taught a lot of other women, who had a lot of disciples. So the first woman to ordain was Mahapajapati, and she taught many women. There's other very famous teachers like Pitaka, Dharmadina. But what I find very lovely about the Therigatha, this work, is that it is poetry. It's poetic. And it's extraordinary in that it's some of the oldest extant poetry of India. It's some of the first poems by women in India. It's the first anthology of women's literature in the world. Quite extraordinary. So we're reading them both as Dharma, both as spiritual teaching and as poetry. And perhaps the two are distinct. Yeah. And there's something, I think, quite fluid and ungraspable. So not only have they been transcribed from the oral tradition to a written language, and then the written language has evolved. So they've gone from vernacular to a very early Pali to a more sophisticated Pali. But also as poetry was very nascent at that time. So the sense of poetic form and metre has also evolved. And so that's had an influence in how they've been preserved. And then, of course, we've got the different translations, which I'll come on to in a little bit. But what it means over this huge period of time, there's been a certain amount of shuffling and reworking of stories. But I think it's perhaps not surprising in all of that sometimes we find the same story shared by several Theris, or sometimes one Theri has several stories. So there's a certain a sort of richness that means that things have popped up in different places. It doesn't all quite cohere. And what the poems do is they celebrate the experience of nirvana, or enlightenment. So they celebrate it rather than discuss it. So they're not, if you're looking for instructions or theory, that's not what you get. Rather, they're stories of liberation. And maybe we get a sense of the truth and clarity of the awakened experience, of the awakened mind. And maybe that provides us with our own little glimpses or epiphanies of what that might be. We might get a taste of the same freedom that we're reading, or when we read one of these songs. So they're to be read for faith and inspiration. And in his introduction to his book, Charles Hallisey quotes a Sinhala novelist, Martin, I think I had to say this, Wickramasinghe. I think that's right. So he translated the Therigatha into Sinhala. And so in this quote, he mentions the veena, which is a stringed instrument. And what he said about the Therigatha was the songs, which have a deep meaning, were first played on the veenas that were the hearts of the Theris. They had been disappointed in life, whether after enduring suffering or enjoying pleasure, and they had learnt how to ease their own anguish. The songs of their hearts can be heard even now by reading their poems. So I just love that image of the songs were played on these veenas that were the hearts of the Theris. So the hearts like a musical instrument, singing forth or playing these songs of awakening. And what do they sing of? They sing of Nibbana, the unsurpassed safety from all that holds you back. Yeah, that complete freedom. Sakula says, I got rid of all that fouls the heart. I am cool and free. And Abhaya said, I have finished with craving. The Buddha's teaching has been done. And Kala said, the great dark is torn apart, and death, you too are destroyed. So they're quite strong and emphatic cries of freedom. And of course these nuns are concerned with the mental defilements of craving, aversion and ignorance, and with their destruction. So they often talk about these three maybe as the depravities. So Tissa, the nun Tissa says, when you are free from everything that holds you back, you can live in the world without the depravities that ooze out from within. This is quite a sort of visceral sense of these things oozing out. And often the affirmation of their statements, the affirmation of their attainments appear frequently in the form of the Tevijja, or knowing the three things that most don't know. So that this is a refrain that comes up quite a lot in the Therigatha. And Vajratara is going to say more about those three things, but just in brief, they are knowing your past lives, knowing where and why others are reborn, and knowing that all that holds you back has been eliminated and that you will not be reborn. So those are the three knowledges. But what I find interesting when I was reading about this is that there's a similar three knowledges in the Brahminical tradition that would have been very well known at the time. And in that tradition, the assumption was that no woman of any caste was capable of attaining these knowledges. So this joyful affirmation of the Tevijja is also explicitly triggering the association with these three Brahminical knowledges. And in that, quite robustly rejecting the view of women's spiritual inferiority. So in the Therigatha, there's plenty of suffering expressed in relation to the lives of the women. Many had very difficult lives. But there's also no sense of that suffering being about karmic fruits or of these women deserving their positions, but that can creep in a bit with the commentaries. And there's different sorts of songs that these women sing. Some are simple verses of encouragement and exhortation by the nun to herself, or sometimes they're said to have been spoken by the Buddha to the nun. Others are conversations with Mara. When I say, I see you, you can't fool me. Some are recounting how they went forth, what happened, conversations with husbands and parents, personal tragedies. And then some are verses that are repeated as they gain enlightenment, and often later at death. So they become their death verses. The part of the ungraspability of the Therigatha is also in the translation into English. Again, if you just have a little look at some of the different translations, you realise quite what different flavours these translators can bring to their work. So one nun, Chitta, in one translation she says, dark delusion I rent asunder. In another translation it reads, after splitting open the mass of mental darkness. And in another translation, this is Rhys Davies, talks about breaking away the wildering gloom that long had closed me in. So they've got quite different feels to them. I often find I actually quite like Rhys Davies' one, but I also like the second one I read was Hallisey. I enjoy his translations too. But just before I finish, what I wanted to say was what's been on my mind is, well, what are they? What are these songs? What are these women for us? And I feel that they are hold a mythical place for us as women practicing the Dharma in the 21st century, especially in extraordinary conditions like this where we're having to do it all virtually and online. It's so different. And yet we have something in common with these women from nearly 2,500 years ago. I think it makes me think of the way the ancient Greeks used to look back to a former time of heroes and giants. And I think we can look back to these former times. These are our spiritual elders. These are the great women from the past. These are almost like our ancient crones. I'm quite into crones, I mean crone positively. These ancient crones that we are part of the lineage of. And what they're saying to us is that it always has been possible for women to follow the spiritual path. It always has been possible for women to awaken, even in societies that are oppressive, even in societies where women struggle to find their voice. It always has been possible, and they have done it. And so perhaps if we listen carefully, we too may hear their song, and we may hear their encouragement as it comes down to us through the millennia, and we may feel our heart also responding to their declarations of delight and joy at seeing the way things are and finding freedom.